everyone. Welcome to the Tribal Council podcast, where on this podcast, Survivor represents our life, and when it's gone, so are we. My name's Ethan Kronk, and I am joined by my co-host, Connor Boudreau. How are you doing tonight, Connor?
Doing quite well, and today's going to be a very exciting one because we are finally into the 10th placers, meaning we're at approximately the halfway mark for this series, approximately the halfway mark in terms of placements, and kind of at the tipping point where, a lot of players at this point going forward will have made some bigger impacts on the Survivor New Era.
Yeah, and to kick us off, we're going to be talking about the worst 10th placer in the new era. At 9th place, we have from Survivor 42, Rocksroy Bailey. Now, Rocksroy starts out the game on the Ika tribe. He does sort of form a bit of an alliance with Drea and Romeo, but he sort of rubs everyone the wrong way just with his bossiness at camp and his poor social play, but he rubs Tori off more so in the wrong way than anyone else. Tori really does not like him. We see they go to tribal council. He wants Tori gone, but he ends up settling to vote out Zach. They go to another tribal council where, he again wants Tori gone, this time not as willing to settle, ends up voting for her, but Swati is sent home instead. And then he makes the merge. Ika doesn't go to another tribal. There's the hourglass twist. Rocksroy sent to exile. He smashes the hourglass, so he's immune. He is left out of the Lydia vote. He ends up voting for Lindsay, but he is in on the Chanel vote. And then there's a split tribal where he ends up with a group that just sort of sees him as an easy person to get rid of, and he goes home.
Part of the biggest thing for us that comes into play for Rocksroy is that ultimately he never really establishes enough social bonds that really help develop his game in a positive way. He's definitely a social outcast for a lot of it, and I think that's partially emphasized by the hourglass twist, him, just not overall being picked and not really being looked at as too much of a threat at any point either, and he still goes home fairly early into the merge. So he really just doesn't have any great social connections, big social bonds that really will prolong his life in the game, or strategic plays that'll kind of, make him look like a threat or anything, but they still just target him out.
Yeah, not to mention he goes to 5 tribal councils and only votes correctly in 2 of them. Now, if you take out the one where he goes home, that still accounts for 4 tribal councils where he only votes correctly in half of them. So that's just not a good look either. Just his general perennial being on the outs and just not rubbing people the right way ends up putting him here at number 9.
And then at number 8, we have Naseer Mutalif. He is in a similar position where he kind of starts off the game with a bit of a rocky start. He has some distrust among some tribe members, and he starts to kind of solidify things with a couple of his tribe mates. He ends up as a piece of the All Black Alliance at one point, and he does ultimately end up with an idol through one of the weirder Survivor twists where you can just, say a line. If someone in every other tribe says a line, congrats, you now have a fully working idol. And that ends up being part of his downfall eventually. He starts to end up in a situation where, again, some people don't necessarily rub the same way as him. His social awareness starts to be, more apparent as to how lackluster it is. And he kind of ends up in a point where his partnership with Deshawn and Danny ultimately is enough to get him, through the Sydney vote. But at the following tribal, he ends up being voted out.
Yeah, so really, he ends up putting himself on the outs early on when he tries to call out Danny and Deshawn for potentially looking for an idol. It doesn't go well for him. He does, though, make it to the merge due to his tribe never going to tribal council, and even then he wasn't really shown to be the main target on that tribe. He does go to a split tribal. However, he really makes an enemy with Heather, and then that combined with people wanting to flush his idol just leads to him going home. And like Connor said, it's a combination of factors: his social awareness, his management of the idol, his just the way that he sort of handles Danny and Deshawn, the way he handles Heather. It's just not great, and he just doesn't display a real knack for the game at any point. So that puts him here at number 8. Now at number 7, we have from Survivor 44, Brandon Cottom. Brandon starts off sort of in a decent position, it seems, but then when he finds the idol alongside Maddie, and Maddie wants to keep it a secret from the other tribe in order to sort of form a duo with Brandon, he's not about that. He wants to tell everyone. This makes an enemy in Maddie, and she ends up rallying the troops against him. However, he plays an idol, and idles Maddie out. He sort of re-ingratiates himself with the Ratu tribe, and then going to the merge, it's Ratu versus Soka. Nobody's really thinking about Brandon as someone who needs to go right away. He's a big challenge threat, but that's about it. He, I believe, is in on the Josh vote. No, he isn't actually. He's on the outs because he votes for Jam Jam. And then, basically, there's the split tribal. Matt gets voted out. He's part of that. That's great. And then at the next tribal, he gets idled out when he and his fellow Ratus attempt to target Franny. Danny is made known about it. He puts his idol on Franny. They decide to target Brandon, probably mainly because of his, challenge ability, winning the first 2 immunities of the merge. And yeah, he goes home.
And to really emphasize some other points of Brandon's game, he's also just a pretty messy player in general. He mentioned he was out of that Jam Jam vote. Aside from that, throwing a random vote on Jam Jam was just never really something that makes a ton of sense. He causes himself to need to play an idol in the first episode, which is typically not a strong showing of your ability to, read the room, make those connections, and not, cause distrust at any point. And yeah, he does end up getting idled out, which is part of why he's a little bit higher ranking than, say, Rocksroy or Naseer. There is something that comes into play, and he is at times a significantly more reliable and trusted player than the previous 2. But it's not like he plays a significantly better game than a lot of the other players in this placement, which brings us to, I think, kind of the next tier, and our next player in general, which is Sol Yi of Survivor 47. Sol's game starts off with him building up a really good, strong connection with Aisha, with 2 other pairs kind of forming. You kind of see right off the bat that Rome and Genevieve end up in a pairing, and then Kashan and Teeny end up in a pairing. Well, Sol and Aisha probably think they're in pretty good spots. However, then there is kind of, this burning issue with Rome that comes up. Rome finds himself an idol, and everyone kind of ends up afraid of him. They kind of expect him to play the idol, but they're still thinking about going after him anyways. But Aisha does go. Sol then takes the next round, pretty much on the chin. Genevieve says, hey, look, you 2 gotta stop fighting, and survives that. So again, through some decent self-preservation, he finds himself in a situation where he gets through another difficult tribal. They end up in a merge tribe situation, and he manages to cobble up a couple of numbers along the way, gets through a couple chaotic tribals, but ultimately, the person who ends up saving him back in his second tribal council, Genevieve, decides that it's time to blindside Sol, and he gets targeted out. To add to that, he does make a couple good relationships in Teeny and at the merge point Rachel as well, to show some of his social connections. But ultimately, his lack of game awareness and his ability to, survive as long as he can does eventually run out.
Yeah, that's really the main point, is just his lack of game awareness. He's on the outs for a lot of the pre-merge, though he does wind up being able to preserve his spot in the game and survive. Come the merge, he does make a lot of good allies, he does form a lot of good connections, and actually ends up becoming enough of a threat for Genevieve to want to take him out and make that as a big move for her resume. And I think that's something that you have to give Sol a lot of credit for. I think he has more social awareness than the players that we have below him. I think he finds himself in less hot water than the players we have below him, despite the fact that he does find himself again on the outs. And but ultimately he does find him, like I said, like I keep repeating, he does find himself on the outs, and so that's not great either, and that's kind of what keeps him in the lower part of this list. the lower half, I guess, if you will. And to sort of kick off right smack dab in the middle of the list, we have from Survivor 48, Chrissy Sarnowsky. Now, Chrissy starts on Siva. She forms sort of a four-person alliance where Charity and Mitch are on the outs. Fortunately for her, Siva doesn't go to tribal before the swap, so she gets swapped onto this tribe with Say, Cedric, Mitch, and Bianca. It seems like it should be sort of a war between the original Vulas and the original Sivas, with Chrissy and Say being the main targets. However, Say ends up becoming the target only for Cedric to flip it onto Bianca after she tells him that she does not have a vote. So Bianca goes home there. Chrissy is in on that plan. She makes it to the merge. She's obviously in on the unanimous Charity vote. Then we see she's in on the Say vote at the split tribal. But ultimately, she tries to call it the Strong Five Alliance. It doesn't go well for her. David kind of tries to go to bat to her for her because he'd rather see Camilla go, but Kyle isn't having any of that. He wants Camilla in this game. He wants Chrissy gone. And Kyle gets what he wants, so Chrissy ends up going home.
And I think that is a good point that you emphasized at the end there. She wasn't really in danger early, but when, an opportunity arose where things could go her way, that she could become potentially, a player deeper into the season, she decides to make a move that would definitely make her a bigger target right off the bat. She's like, yep, there's this powerful group. I'm going to call it out. And the way she goes about it, not a terrible idea sometimes, but ultimately when you light it up in their face that, hey, they're a big alliance, and they are all tight, happy together, they stuck together and they voted her out. So I definitely think there was better ways, maybe find dissension within the ranks, maybe separate them, split them apart in ways that you convince them that the alliance isn't as good as they want it to think they are, but ultimately, she manages to find herself in a lot of great situations, and then the second opportunity presents itself that she can ruin it, she does. That brings us to our next player, who is going to be number 4 on our rankings, and that is Michelle Chukwujekwu. I believe I said that correctly, but our most recent season, Survivor 49. She immediately emerges as a strategic and a social powerhouse on the original Hina tribe. She also ends up finding a hidden immunity idol right before a swap stage, where she ends up finding herself on the now Uli tribe, but again still in a majority, given that there is 4 old Hinas. Finds herself with...
Yeah, just a correction. Technically, it's the new Kellie tribe.
Oh, sorry, new Kellie tribe, yes. So yeah, she finds herself now on the Kellie tribe with, again, a majority of Hinas. There's Shannon, there's Sage, and there's still Alex, all of which could possibly go before MC, and again, if not, she still has an idol. And then we get to a second swap, lasts a single round, where she would have been out of the majority, but again, doesn't go to tribal because she's, again, a bit of a powerhouse in the game, and would have had an idol anyways, so she was really at no risk or threat of going home in the situation. Instead, we get to a swap tribal situation where there's like a split group, and half of them get to go have a feast, half of them are stuck in a very difficult tribal council situation where, there seems to be an obvious answer, and then all of a sudden, Juwan's name gets thrown out. Michelle's doing the right thing potentially, goes, hey, just letting you know, your name's out there, and somehow Juwan ends up using this and wanting to go after MC, so all of a sudden, Rizzo takes that, runs with it, Savannah shows up, they run with it, and instead of possibly Sophie going out, which would have made more sense, and I think almost every situation, we end up seeing MC kind of get blindsided pretty early into the merge.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, the Hina dynamics are kind of hard to parse, one of the more difficult tribes to really understand what was going on there, but we are explicitly told that she's supposedly Stephen's closest ally, and we do know that Stephen was the most powerful person on that tribe. So she's sitting pretty in the pre-merge. She's doing great. And then at the merge, she pulls off the Nate blindside. It's not necessarily something she spearheads, but she's definitely a part of it. And then, yeah, she kind of gets screwed over by this split tribal. she makes a move that, I don't know, shouldn't necessarily put a target on her back, but it does, and, you know, I do think you have to sort of assume that there's some reason why it did, that there's some reason she could have predicted it, and that maybe it wasn't the best way for her to go about things, but at the end of the day, it's very understandable why she does what she does, and the fact that it ends up getting her voted out is a little bit tragic. She just ends up in a higher spot on this list than everyone else that we've talked about so far, due to that factor, just due to the fact that she was so dominant in the pre-merge, and then come merge, she kind of goes home partially due to a twist, partially due to some confusing reactions to certain players to the decisions that she decides to make. That being said, at number 3, I should say, we have from Survivor 46, Tevin Davis. Now, Tevin finds himself on the original Nami tribe. He immediately forms an alliance with Hunter and Soda, leaving Venus, Randon, and Liz sort of all on the outs. Randon gets medically evacuated, giving his alliance more of a clear majority, but ultimately Siva doesn't go to Tribal Council. Tevin goes into the merge as, you know, a pretty strong player. I believe he's technically meant to be part of the Six, as Hunter's addition to it. Not that the Six is a particularly meaningful alliance, obviously, but he is in on the Mariah vote at the merge, and then he does vote for Venus at the next tribal he attends at the split tribal. However, this was ultimately part of a blindside against Soda that he pulls off. Venus, of course, wants to take credit for the Soda blindside. That causes some animosity between her and Tevin, but really what ends up getting Tevin voted out is that he just puts too much of a target on his back too early, making that big move against Soda. People recognize that he is a threat in this game. He's a social threat, he's a strategic threat, and they decide that he has to go home.
Yeah, part of what has affected the ranking of Tevin is, again, like a lot of the players we've just previously mentioned, Chrissy, MC, Tevin also ends up in a great situation pretty early on. He is definitely a part of majorities and has good numbers, but a big difference is Tevin is pretty clearly shown, as far as mostly edit's concerned, as the top dog in this group of numbers. He has his number 1 in Hunter, and they are in control of the dynamics early on in the tribe. When he wants to make a move, it's kind of what immediately happens, although, again, some animosity comes up because of it, and, that's part of how it ends up working out. I would also say another aspect that comes in is there is a bit of a chaos element to that, round of tribal. Q going kind of off script and talking about possibly quitting, and then that plays a bit of into the dynamic as well. It's really not as easy for Tevin to make a clear counter move and avoid being voted out with all the smokescreen to it, but at the same time he does have a very good game for the very early parts of it up into the merge, and even then he makes an even bigger move and really sets himself apart. So it's really bad threat level management on his part that is ultimately what stops him from being 1 or 2. However, it is definitely the fact that he becomes such a threat in the first place that puts him this high on the list. Now, on to our number 2 player. We have James Jones of Survivor 43, player who, again, has a good spot on the Coco drive, good strong early position, Carla being probably his number 1 ally for the majority of the game, and he powers that with some great strategic social prowess pretty early on that helps him get through the merge stage pretty easily. There isn't really much concern of him going home at any point, and then he stumbles onto a knowledge is power, which is part of what I think starts his downfall a little bit. Unfortunately, finding an advantage that so many people know about, it doesn't necessarily help him. And then on top of that, he ends up going out in a split tribal council round. So it's a bit of a tougher situation. 2 players make a really good move on him, the tribal council, after he made a really good move himself. and is just overall really highly touted social player, but that ends up being part of his downfall is as well just some really strong gameplay pretty early on.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I would have much to add to that aside from ultimately, when he does go home, I do think like it takes a little bit more to get him out. It's not just like a simple, okay, this guy's a big threat, we're gonna vote him out. Owen is definitely a big target. That tribal, Noah or Noel, and like Noel kind of has to pull some crazy stuff alongside Owen. Meanwhile, Sammy is only willing to do it if Carla's able to be convinced, and that's something that takes a lot of convincing for Carla. It's something that she hesitates a lot on. So at the end of the day, like, it takes a little bit more to get James out of the game. And he does find himself in a very similar position early on. He does find himself in a very similar position, once the merge strikes. So ultimately, James and Tevin, they're very different players, but they play very similar games on paper. And it just came down to smaller details that we ended up putting James above Tevin. That being said, filling out the number 1 spot, we have Kellie Nalbandian. Kellie starts off on the Bello tribe. She sort of described that she's able to kick it with the boys, she's able to kick it with the girls, and she ends up finding her closest ally in Brando. But her and Brando, they both have this ability to sort of connect with everyone, so again, they're sort of in between the rest of the girls in the tribe and the rest of the boys in the tribe. They never end up having to make a decision, though, because they don't go to tribal until a swap rolls around. Again, she's put on a swap mostly with men from her original tribe, and had she just full-on gone with the women, made it clear that that's where she was headed, then this could have potentially put her in danger, but at the end of the day, Kellie was never going to be in danger, even if the swap tribe did go to tribal council, which they didn't. Come the merge, obviously she's in on the Caleb vote, that was unanimous. She's in on the Jemiah vote, that was unanimous. She is in on either the Sifu or the Caleb vote. I forget which tribal she goes to. But I do know that she votes correctly. She's in on that plan. She makes it happen. And she just plays a really solid game up until the point where she's voted out. At this point, it's decided, like, Abello needs to go home. Bruce has an idol, or we target him. Maybe we target Jake. He seems like an easy target. He seems like an easy threat to get rid of. But ultimately, the Reba 4, they come to the conclusion that, hey, this Kellie person is insanely threatening. She has such good social capital. She is a very strategic player. We need to send her home before she becomes a problem. I don't think that she does as much to, sort of make herself that big of a threat as some other people on this list, but she just plays really well. It ends up kind of being discovered by the other players, and she is sent home in one of the more entertaining blindsides of Survivor New Era history, I'll say.
Yeah, there's some pretty iconic quotes from that blind side. There's some pretty big gameplay moves that get her in that situation in the first place. I mean, ultimately, she does suffer a bit from the Bruce tax, and just could not seem to get him to get the memo that she was not his best friend out there. And as you also mentioned, Jake almost is the target for that round and almost is voted out as well. So it's not like it was a clean, easy decision. Yep, Kellie's gone. All right, boom. Like James as well, there is that consideration of, oh, okay, maybe this is the move, or, this person has to pull this strings to make this happen. It isn't like she gets swapped into a situation, she's screwed. People do actually have to work to make it happen, and it is a pretty big move that helps decide and, alter a big chunk of the game going forward for the players.
Yeah, for sure. Again, like her, James, Tevin, even MC, like they all kind of end up in this position where they're top 2 on their original tribe, only to get voted out due to their massive social threat levels. So the top 4, are really sort of in their own league on this list, and they really were difficult to sort of order due to the similarities in their game. But I think Kellie finds herself in the most dominant position with just the most clear connections to both sides of her tribal dynamics. And then I think that she goes the longest without necessarily being discovered as a threat. I think James is clocked very early on, Tevin is clocked very early on, MC, she doesn't so much go home due to being a threat, so that's a little bit different. But Kellie isn't clocked as much until really right around where she goes home. Otherwise, they look at Caleb as the big threat, and then like Jay, Sifu are kind of easy votes, but I don't think they're thinking. We don't see a whole lot of people going, Kellie needs to be taken out soon, until push comes to shove and Kellie needs to be taken out now, and that's when it happened. That's when they strike, and it's a big blindside. So that's really the main reason she goes above the other players that we've talked about who are near the top of this list. But that being said, Connor, is there anything else that you have to say before we wrap things up?
Yeah, just if anyone has any comments that they would like to contribute towards the placements, whether you agree, disagree, any points that you think you would like to contribute in the comments down below would be kindly appreciated. We love to interact with you guys, so if there's anything you want to talk about game-wise and the placements of the 10th placers, we would love to hear that down below in the comments section.
Yes, 100%. And if you enjoy the content, drop a like, consider subscribing, and we'll really appreciate it. So, but regardless, we appreciate your time. We appreciate you giving us a watch. We hope that you'll tune in for the next one. But for now, the pod has spoken.